Hello and welcome back to Gaming Bench. I'm looking at the 2024 updated release of Until Dawn with these set of benchmarks, and I had to find a good spot to test because there's a lot of stuff that it's hard to benchmark in this game because the scenes are shifting and stuff. You can see here starting with the 4060 and 7600 XT. These are about as close to perfectly tied as you're ever going to see with two graphics cards in the game, both getting around 80 frames per second. Let's go ahead and move on. Next up, we have the 4070 and the 7900 GRE. As usual, AMD's card is quite a bit faster. It's the same price, which is why I'm comparing these two cards. Like some people say, well, it's more supposed to compete with the 4070 Super. You can say that, but the 4070 costs $530, $550. So does the GRE. That makes them competitors, and the GRE gets like 130 frames per second compared to about 110 frames per second. Kicking up to the high-end cards, again, trying to keep prices relatively similar. The XTX costs around $1,000 nominally, but I've seen it on sale for as low as $800, often more like $900. The 4080 Super, a bit more expensive, maybe $950 minimum price, often at $1,000 or more. And these two cards are also basically tied, although 1% lows are worse on the Nvidia card, so keep that in mind. A little bit more stutter, nothing below 60 frames per second though. And then finally, we have the king of GPUs, the RTX 4090, that costs nominally $1,600. Right now, it seems like making way for the 5090 that's probably coming in January. We're getting prices creeping up. They're at like $1,800 maybe these days. So almost double the cost of the 7900 XT, and it is getting 170 frames per second or more, 120 minimums, compared to 142 on the 7900 XTX. So here's the overall look at standings. 1080p medium, obviously not the intended way to play with these super high-end cards, but it's a good spot maybe for budget cards. Even the 4060 and 7600 XT are more than capable of handling 1080p medium in Until Dawn. And this is at native resolution, no upscaling. The game does support FSR3 with frame generation, also DLSS3 with frame generation, and I believe XESS as well, but I didn't test any Intel cards, so we won't worry about XESS, will we? Alright, that does it for the medium results. Let's kick up to the ultra settings. I should note the game does support ray tracing as well. It's only for reflections and ambient occlusion, so not super important, also not super impactful on performance. I'll get to that later. The 4060 and 7600 XT, this time the 4060 has just a slight advantage, like 1 or 2 FPS is all, but otherwise very comparable. And they're still playable, but they're dropping below 60. Not a huge problem because this game is super slow in most of the gameplay, so you can easily run at sub 60 frames per second and be fine. I mean, here you see the 4070 and the 7900 GRE. Again, AMD's card has maybe a 10 to 15% performance advantage, a little bit bigger on the minimum FPS, but still very playable. The game was originally designed for the PlayStation Move controllers, and so there's a lot of stuff that doesn't really translate over well to a keyboard and mouse. I mean, you can play the game, but you can tell like it was created for a different kind of controller, and they didn't totally fix that or update that with the port. 4080 Super and 7900 XTX. This is interesting. Same minimum FPS basically, but the Super this time is getting about 106 frames per second compared to just under 100 frames per second on the XTX. So that's kind of the reverse of what we saw at 1080p medium, and sometimes that's just like the caching algorithms and other stuff taking effect. So not a huge deal because again, 1080p Ultra isn't even really the intended target for those GPUs. And 4090 versus 7900 XTX, of course, if the 4080 Super is faster than the XTX, so is the 4090. It's getting 135 frames per second, 101 on the minimums, so a solid 35 to 40% faster than the XTX. Very playable, but also not really the intended resolution. Though if you use upscaling, like performance mode upscaling, you're rendering at 1080p and upscaling to 4K. Anyway, here's the overall charts. Nvidia's GPUs sitting in the top 2 spots at 1080p Ultra, but then we get the XTX and the GRE, and obviously AMD's offering a better value with the GRE than the 4070. And then at the bottom, the 4060 and 7600 XT are basically tied. So the double VRAM, the 16 gigabytes on the 7600 XT isn't making a huge difference in performance, at least not yet. But the 4060 often is the faster card if VRAM isn't an issue, so that does indicate this is a console port, so maybe a little bit more love for the AMD GPUs. 1440p, this is where things start to get a little difficult, shall we say, on the lower end cards. So the 7600 XT and 4060 basically tied still. There's a slight advantage for the 7600 XT now, and they're both hovering around just over 30 frames per second, minimums dipping below that. But like I said, this was designed for a console and a controller that 30 frames per second was the goal, not 60, so it's still playable. 4070 and 7900 GRE, same story. The GRE is getting just over 60 frames per second on average, not while I'm recording, which is what I'm doing in these videos, but when you're not recording, it's averaging 61 compared to 52 on the 4070. So AMD does have the clear advantage there, almost 20%. And then as we get to the end of this run, we'll see the high-end cards, and like I was saying earlier, even though 1440p might not be the intended target a lot of the times, native 1440p is a good proxy for upscaled quality mode 4K, because they're both rendering at 1440p. The one just uses upscaling, which does have some overhead, so it's not exactly apples to apples. But here, the 4080 Super still has a slight advantage, 85 frames per second compared to 80, which of course means that if we shift to the RTX 4090, it has a much bigger advantage. It's cruising along at over 110 frames per second average compared to just 89 frames per second on the 7900 XTX. But I will say, like, when we get to the native 4K, we'll see these positions swap. I won't get ahead of myself, sorry. Overall, very playable even at native 1440p on pretty much all of the GPUs. I mean, you could use maybe a lower setting or a little bit of upscaling on the bottom tier GPUs, but still 1440p is definitely in reach for how slow the game tends to run. I guess I haven't finished the game, so maybe later on in the game it gets a little more intense and higher frame rates might matter, but I will say, like, everything I've seen so far, the game feels so slow, so running at 30 frames per second doesn't really bother me. In fact, we'll get to this later, but frame gen is very helpful for running 4K even on the budget GPUs, because native 4K is going to just totally kill performance, as we'll see in a moment here. Basically tied on the budget, AMD has the advantage on the mid-range, Nvidia has the advantage on the top cards. 4K native resolution, not with ray tracing though, we'll do ray tracing next. We are definitely not getting great results on the bottom tier budget GPUs. The 4060 is getting like 17 frames per second compared to 19 on the 7600 XT. So that does mean that the extra VRAM on the AMD card probably is starting to help out. You'll definitely want upscaling and or frame gen to really make it playable on those budget GPUs at 4K. 4070 and 7900 GRE, still big advantage to the AMD card, and it's actually even larger this time, 36 frames per second or so on the GRE compared to 27 frames per second on the 4070. So definitely running better on the AMD cards. It's, what is that, like a 30% advantage? It's a lot. So this is where the 12 gigabytes and less compute and all that stuff is coming into play and holding back the Nvidia card. And then finally, we have the 7900 XTX versus the 4080 Super. We'll have the 4090 as well, but this is interesting because the 7900 XTX is now slightly faster than the Nvidia card, and that's partly because it's got 24 gigabytes of memory and a 384-bit memory interface, so it's got 50% more memory bandwidth, and that definitely helps. I mean, the 4090 has the same amount of memory bandwidth, roughly, as the XTX. And then here we have the XTX with the 4090. And the 4090 does take the lead. It's 65 frames per second compared to 50 frames per second, 47 frames per second on the 4080 Super. All of them are playable, and like I said, it's not this super fast Twitch game, so it doesn't really matter that you're only getting above 30 frames per second and you're not getting 60 frames per second. Still definitely playable. But let's go ahead and look at the overall charts. So this is our 4K native resolution, no upscaling, no ray tracing either. And the only card to break 60 frames per second is the 4090. That probably means there are some areas of the game where it will be more playable than the lower tier cards. 4070 now drops below 30 frames per second. That's not great. Of course, you've still got frame generation upscaling that you can use. The GRE is just getting above 30 frames per second, doing okay, and then the 4080 Super and the XTX are doing just fine. But let's go ahead and push things to the next level. So I've said it supports ray tracing. I don't think it does a lot graphically, but let's go ahead and look at the ray tracing performance, and we'll start at the bottom end. Obviously, the 4060 and the 7600 XT are not really happy running ray tracing. It doesn't have a massive hit on performance. I mean, they're both tied, basically, getting 15 frames per second on average, minimums of 13 frames per second. The video is going to be very choppy and stuttery here. This isn't a great way to play. And you might think, oh, well, 4K on these low-end cards, it's just not viable. We'll get to that next, trust me. But let's go ahead and move up one level to the 4070 and the 7900 GRE. 7900 GRE drops about 15% from its non-ray tracing performance. And just doing ray traced ambient occlusion and reflections, I mean, I don't think there's any ray traced reflections in this scene. I don't know if that matters too much. But the 4070 is at 25 frames per second, so it narrows the gap. AMD takes more of a hit from the ray tracing than Nvidia does, but neither one is running like super smooth and awesome. And then as we finish this up, let's go to the 4080 Super and the XTX. At 4K native without ray tracing, the XTX card was a little bit faster than the 4080 Super, and now they've swapped positions. The 4080 Super is getting 43 frames per second compared to 42 frames per second, a little bit higher minimum FPS as well. Not a huge deal, and visually it's not a huge deal either. And I should note, like, the difference in video colors is almost certainly just the way that the AMD video capture utility works compared to Nvidia's Shadowplay. Shadowplay seems to get a little more bluish or whiter than a little bit dimmer on the AMD side. But if you're just playing the game, that's not actually a difference in how it's rendered. It's just the video capture. But the 4090, of course, is running much faster at 60 frames per second almost compared to 42. Here's the overall standings. Again, ray tracing with ultra settings at 4K native resolution. That's pretty demanding. None of the GPUs are liquid smooth all the time. The 4090 does fine. You can totally play it that way. And the same goes for the 4080 Super and the 7900 XTX. They're totally playable. The GRE, borderline. You could play it, but it's not going to be quite as good of an experience. 4070 definitely starts feeling choppy, and then those budget cards really struggle. So let's see if we can fix that. The game does support FSR3 with FrameGen, as well as DLSS3 with FrameGen. So let's go and turn on quality upscaling with frame generation and see how that goes. And what you'll find is now both of these cards that were formerly struggling at 4K with ray tracing are now doing actually pretty decently. 4060 is faster. It's getting 38 frames per second compared to 34 frames per second, and minimums are at 32 on the 4060 compared to 28. And I will say this, frame generation normally makes things feel a little laggy, but the game feels laggy in general, so it really doesn't matter too much in this particular game, at least in my opinion. So then we go on to the 4070 and the GRE. And here we've got the 4070 pulling 63 frames per second compared to 70 frames per second on the GRE. And AMD's still ahead, but they're both very playable now. This is a game that's like perfectly made for frame generation because it's so sluggish already that it just doesn't seem to really impact the experience in a bad way, at least from what I played. And then we have the 7900 XTX and the 4080 Super. And with upscaling plus frame generation, they're providing a way better experience than they were at 4K native. So now we are getting 103 frames per second on the 4080 Super on average, and 97 frames per second on the 7900 XTX. And yes, that's like half the input speed, so 50-ish frames per second input. But for a game like this, this is like the ideal scenario where frame generation just doesn't really hurt and makes things feel a lot better actually. And the same goes for the RTX 4090 and the XTX card. You're getting a way better experience overall, 134 frames per second on the 4090, so about 37% faster than the XTX. It's super playable, everything looks fine. I think the frame generation on the Nvidia card tends to look a little bit better. I don't know that you'd really notice it in this particular game, but it does have some advantages of doing it all via a hardware and AI solution. So let's go ahead and look at the overall chart and the final standings for 4K with ray tracing and ultra settings at quality mode upscaling with FrameGen. We've got 134 frames per second on the 4090, 103 frames per second on the 4080 Super, XTX gets 97, which is substantially faster than the GRE at 70. Then we've got 63 on the 4070, so it's a little closer, only about 10% behind the GRE. And then finally, the 4060 and 7600 XT, technically playable now at 38 frames per second and 34 frames per second. You might think that looks really slow and bad, but in this particular game, I would say it's perfectly acceptable. Overall, it's a different kind of game, and I don't know that the benchmarks are super important, because you could play this at 30 to 40 frames per second, and it's probably better than the old PlayStation 4 experience and looks nicer. You do need to pay attention to the settings you use and what features you turn on. Like, I noticed the game a lot of times will default back to like different levels of render scaling, not upscaling, but just render scaling. And so if it's at 25%, it looks a lot worse than at 100%. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe. Let me know what else you'd like to see me test, including other games, as well as graphics cards that you might want to see. I'm trying to do budget, mid-range, high-end, and of course the extreme with the 4090. But if there's other cards you'd like to see, let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can do about including them. Until next time, take care.